Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, or more precisely, I went through various stages for this invitation. Doesn't work. Well, never mind. So first, I was really happy because what I want to talk today is about tractability, what tractability does to economics. And this is not a standard keynote in which I did some research and I'm going to present some results. This is the history of a failure. I mean, I've been meaning to work on tractability in the history of economics for a long time, and I failed. I was never able to find the right research design. So this is the history of a failure. I mean, I'm going to talk about something I'm not doing, right? That was my first stage. My first reaction was like, well, as a historian, I can't see how to work on that. I know it's important, and I'm going to try to convey the sense of why it's really important to work on tractability, but I don't know how to do that, but methodologists, maybe they know better, okay? And then, after I accepted, I went into panic mode, and I realized that, in fact, methodologists do write on tractability, and I had a whole literature to actually read and digest and understand. And now I've sort of moved to bargain kind of stage, in which I'm going to try to ask you to help me figure out how your research on tractability as methodologists can help me solve my own issues with tractability as a historian. So that's part of the work I digest. I know some of you are in the room. There is something I want to caveat. I want to talk about. So what I'm going to do here, so there is a sort of like historiographical reason for me to be here. Beyond that topic, tractability, beyond that, there is a historiographical question when I read the work on methodologists on tractability, is how can historians use the methodological literature to clarify their objects, okay? So at some point I'm going to try to summarize what methodologists have been doing, or what I understand that methodologists have been doing on tractability. And it's going to be very rough for two reasons. One is that, unlike what economists tend to think, both methodology or philosophy, economics, and history of thought are sort of real-time jobs with real skills, and we have different skills, and I don't have the sophistication to really understand the whole of what you're writing, clearly. And there is another reason, and that reason in historiographical is that your job is to refine and clarify concepts, and you really clarify them sharply. My problem is that when I try to take that sort of conceptual apparatus and try to use it to look at the world and look at economist practice, it's too clear and too consistent for the messy world. Okay, so I mean, GEM is the journal I read the most after Hope, so I really do read that literature, and I'm kind of frustrated not to be able to use it more in my own research. And the reason I can't use more in my own research is I somehow feel it will sort of over-determine what economists do, right? It's sort of like we'll clarify stuff that are messy, inconsistent, and ambiguous. And as a historian, I don't want to suppress these inconsistency, ambiguities, and what economists think. So that's what I'm trying to straddle. I'm going to give you one example. So what I'm going to talk about for you is a subset of the literature on modeling. And Til Gruner-Jenhoff, in a Erkenntnis special issue in 2008, summarized it, the state of the literature in methodology this way. There are two positions. There are the isolationist and there are the fictionalist, right? And this is meant to describe methodologists, okay? So there's various ways you can actually use that divide. You can ask whether methodologists are isolationist or fictionalist, which is the purpose of that special issue. You can ask whether, say, Krugman core periphery model or Romer endogenous growth model are these models or these papers features like sort of models that are used in an isolationist or fictionalist way, and that's usually what methodologists are doing. You can ask whether Krugman methodology across time as a whole is more isolationist or fictionalist, and you can even ask whether Krugman thinks he's writing models more to isolate causes or to tell stories, right? So what you do tends to be more the two first, and what I tend to do as our historians is more this and that. Okay? That's why it's difficult for me to apply the sort of conceptual apparatus you are refining, right? So that's what's behind that talk. Okay, there. So what I'm going to do in that talk is basically three things. I'm going to sort of define tractability, and like what you do, I'm not going to start from my definition and trying to come out with a consistent definition. So I'm going to use a lot of words in a very vague way that you use in a very precise way. So I apologize for that. Partly it's because, well, I can't do better, and partly it's because it's problematic to do better for me. So I'm going to start with economists' definition of tractability and try to figure out what they think it is, and mostly why they don't talk about it. That's my issue as a historian, trying to research an object that no one talks about. It's really problematic. Then I'm going to move to how you methodologies tend to define and research tractability. And then I'm going to close with what what type of questions I'm asking. So I'm not providing any answer. What I'm trying to do is to clarify the type of question you're asking, the type of economist question you're asking, and the type of question I'm asking. Okay, so that we can try to talk about this afterwards. Okay, so what is tractability? First, it's a feature of models. So I take Gabelaxon just before the crisis. They have a very short paper that is highly interesting that is about what are the properties of a model in economics, and they list 7 ones: parsimony, tractability, conceptual insightfulness, general I can't pronounce it, falsifiability, empirical consistency, and predictive precision, right? And they say they've not been all important at the same time. Sometimes there are hierarchies, sometimes not whatsoever, right? So tractability is in there. It doesn't mean it's an important feature of models or one economists spend a lot of time thinking about, right? It's just in there. Then this is another statement. I'm going to argue throughout the talk that economists don't articulate what tractability is exactly, because for them it's just in the daily business of writing models, okay? Fabio Ghironi is a macroeconomist. He actually explicitly articulate what it's for him in a response to one post I wrote on tractability. So he wouldn't do it in the course of his research. He did it because we talked about it, right? So he says, from my perspective, tractability is a requirement that I must be able to understand transparently the mechanism and results of the model at hand, okay? And other economists would say, basically, that's the possibility, that's a feature of the model that allows me to solve the model, okay? And of course, there is various ways you can solve the model, right? That's the whole problem. So what you can think about in terms of solving a model is sort of like getting a closed form solution, but it's more complicated because in various fields of economics, there are very different conceptions of tractability. That's an excerpt from a mechanism design textbook. Intractability in computer science has different types of meaning and very specific types of meaning that have been important in economics in the past 25 years. And tractability has to do with being able to solve a problem in a polynomial kind of time, and it relates to NP hardness and NP completedness, basically. So it's the ability to solve a problem efficiently, right? So that's not the ability to get a closed form solution from your model. That's a totally different type of tractability. And all these coexist, right? So that's what it is for economists. It's been here for quite a long time. It's really hard to find out economists that really talks about it explicitly. One instance, the first substantial and articulate discussion of tractability I've been able to find so far is by Joan Robinson, right? So she's not discussing the tractability of models because at that time, it was in 32, it was just the beginning of using models, so she's discussing theoretical tractability, right? She wrote that at the end while she was finishing working on her theory of imperfect competition that would be published the next year. There is a lot of methodological discussion in Cambridge, but usually you're not supposed to actually put them in a separate paper. So what she did here was really atypical, right? So she publishes a very short essay at a school economics is a serious subject, that it hasn't been reprinted, that she let her move on. I mean, she really changed her methodology afterwards, right? But what is interesting is that it's about, the whole essay is about tractability. So she discussed modeling, and she discussed disagreement about theoretical modeling at Cambridge and in Europe more widely. And she says, the two questions to be asked of a set of assumptions in economics, so she's talking about disagreement. Do they correspond to the real world? And are they, well, that's the other way, are they tractable? And do they correspond to the real world? The first question can only be answered by the application of analytical techniques to the assumption. Some sets of assumptions are too complicated to be manageable by the technique which is now at our disposal. But a set of assumptions that is now manageable is likely to be unreal. Okay? So she sort of unpacked that tensions that is at the heart of the methodology of modeling, that there is a trade-off between tractability and realism to some extent, right? She doesn't stop there. She says, okay, so how do you choose? How do you choose between the most manageable but unrealistic set of assumptions and the other one? And she says it's a matter of taste. She says usually the optimistic analytical English economist, so there is disagreement with people like Srafa beyond that. Well, this is another story, but she's actually trying to deal with some controversy around her at that time. So the optimistic analytical English economist is going to choose a manageable set, and the pessimistic methodological continental economist, that she sometimes calls a statistician in the text, will choose a realistic set, right? And so I'm going to take some flack for being optimistic and analytical, and so she's trying to defend herself, okay? And she says, well, it doesn't matter that it's unrealistic because there is progress. I mean, she actually used the word progress. When I have got well used to using my two-dimensional techniques, she's talking about supply and demands and partial equilibrium and a Marshall, I will try to evolve the three-dimensional or n-dimensional techniques which will be capable of solving the problem which arises in your assumption, okay? So don't worry, I mean, I might not be realistic right now, but things are gonna get better at some point, right? And she concludes the essay by saying, economists is still in infancy, more because of the intractable nature of the subject than because of the low mental caliber of economists. Right? So she's really trying to get a message through here.
You changed your tone later in life.
Yeah. No, that's why it's difficult to find the essay, and with exception of Aslan Beghi and Oakes and a few others, they don't even mention that essay. But I mean, I'm not concerned with how she changed her methods. I'm just concerned with the fact that she's one of the only economists who actually wrote on tractability. Right? So that was about theory, and at the same time, economists start building models. You all know your Mary Morgan story. And so you begin to find the same kinds of tension in, for instance, Steenbergen's writing. It's a quote that is excerpted from some work by Mary Morgan. And so Steenbergen writes, in order to be realistic, the model has to assume a great number of elementary questions and variables. In order to be workable, it should assume a smaller number of them. It is a task of business cycle theory to pass between this killer and Charybdis. If possible, that all the solution must be found in such simplification of the detailed picture as do not invalidate its essential features. Right. So same tensions here. Okay. So there is a tension, and you can see it in Robinson more. Making tractability assumption is supposed to be transitory, right? So that's where we are for the moment. The problem is that the more we move closer to now, the less there is explicit discussion about tractability. You find the world. You also find, like, I'm making this for simplification or for convenience or whatsoever. But, I mean, it's beyond the radar. It's not very articulated. One very important, you can find it in a very important paper called After Keynesian Macroeconomics that was presented by Sargent and Lucas at a 78 conference. So this is actually a picture of Sargent at that conference. And it's a very important paper because this is a war declaration. And in his remembrance, Lucas says, we were a renegade. We really wanted to make a statement. Okay, so it's a highly violent paper. It used the term failure, so failure of new Keynesian macroeconometrics like 20 times, and it discussed tractability, right? So they propose their new classical framework, and they say there are no theoretical reasons. So they make a set of assumptions that they defend that includes linearization using quadratic forms and all sorts of stuff. And they say there are no theoretical reasons that most applied work has used linear models, only compelling technical reason given today's computer technology. And then he says only a few functional forms for agents, objective function, and dynamic stochastic optimum problems have the same analytical tractability. It is only a matter of analytical convenience and not of necessity that equilibrium models have used the assumption of stochastically stationary shock. Okay, so he makes a whole bunch of assumptions. He defines microfoundations. They define microfoundations, but they say, okay, we have to cope with the computer affordance of the times, and this might change later. We might be able to relax some of these assumptions later, right? And tractability is actually a word that Lucas never explained, but used pretty much, okay? Interestingly, at some point he reviews Krugman-Helpsman book at the beginning of the 90s, and I know the Krugman model is one that methodologists have studied a lot, and he begins the review with that sentence: the useful development of an economic idea depends critically on one's ability to formalize it accurately and tractably, right? So for him, it's a really, I never actually articulated it, but it's really important. And it's in his Nobel lecture, is going to talk about functions that ties together the money supply and output. And he says we cannot choose, so the specifics at all for the sake of tractability are highly unrealistic and stylized. We cannot choose among them on the basis of descriptive realism, okay? So that's sort of, he never articulates it, but that's sort of a way to argue. Okay, a way to define his assumption. Okay, and then what is interesting is that it sort of surfaced again after the crisis, where economists are forced to actually justify their modeling choices. One such instance is when a bunch of economists are asked to testify before the Congress on the uses of the SGE. Okay, there is Solo, there is Charlie, there is Golander, and a few others. Okay, and there are some congressional hearings, and what's at stake, among other things, is whether the NSF should keep funding that kind of work, or change the kind of work it sort of fund in terms of economics. And Golander says, so it brings up the issue of tractability, okay, and that doesn't happen very often, okay. So he says how economists fail society. It failed because it over-researched a particular version of the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model that happened to have a tractable formal solution. Whereas more realistic models that incorporate purposeful forward-looking agents were formally unsolvable. Okay? So what he says basically, it wasn't a good idea to try to write tractable model. It has a whole paragraph before saying economists are accused of looking under a lamppost, but that's the only place you can find something, right? What he accused economists of doing is to pursue only one kind of model, that is, only one kind of tractability. And he concludes by saying, the second way in which economists' profession failed society was by letting policymakers believe and sometimes assuring policymakers that the topography of the real world matched the topography of the highly simplified ESG model. Okay. So they made a bunch of tractability assumptions. They only use that type of models, and then they drew policy conclusions from unrealistic models, right? So that's one instance in which it's sort of surface. But on the whole, if you want to work on that, that's something economists do, but don't talk about much, okay? So that's a big issue, right? Yeah, I'm going to skip that. What do methodologists have to say about that? So that's my own very rough rationalization of the work some of you have been doing. The question that you tend to ask, or part of you, is what economists do when they model. One subset of question is why do they make a realistic assumption? Which brings another question is what type of assumption do they make and for what purpose? and that has led them to sort of make typologies of assumption used in modeling. Okay, so Musgrave started in the beginning of the 80s. So we identified negligibility and domain assumption that were reframed as applicability assumption, and then a third type of assumption was brought to the table. It was tractability assumption or derivation facilitators. Okay. And from the beginning, it was understood that they could be both theoretical and empirical, and there was a large type of assumption you would make for tractability reason, either because you just couldn't observe your variable. For instance, Hendricks takes as an example Bob Hall's work on the solar residual, and in these models there is lots of stuff that you cannot directly observe, from productivity growth to cost of capital to marginal cost and whatsoever. So you are forced to make all sorts of assumptions to actually match these with data, because you can't directly observe them. Sometimes you don't even have data access. Sometimes you don't have the computational ability to actually solve your model as it is, so you have to make all sorts of assumptions, right? And one question that was deriving from that work is, are these auxiliary assumptions? Okay? Does it matter? Or is it something that we should take away to concentrate on the critical assumptions, right? And we want to study more the critical assumptions, okay? So I feel there was a tension in the literature. Economists hope that when they make some tractability assumption, first, at some point, they are going to be able to relax them, and second, it's not going to change, it's not going to distort the access to the deeper cause they actually want to identify, right? But it wasn't, so you get an example here. I guess that's what the methodology literature wants to target. That's it's anonymized, because my point is not to trash it. It's just to show how economists write their paper. And they often say stuff like, okay, I'm making that assumption. This is a clear abstraction for reality. It could be interesting to attempt a generalization in that case. However, while we believe that the underlying logical structure and the structural insight would not be substantially affected by assuming a more general discrete distribution, the resulting side of the strategic space will likely render the analysis mathematically intractable. So that's really a standard statement. We're simplifying. We wish we had. We didn't need to do that, but we need to do that. Otherwise, we can't solve the models. But we think it doesn't really change our results. If these assumptions were to be relaxed, it wouldn't change the result, okay? In that case, that's really a leap of faith, because there is no demonstration, right? And so another part of the methodology literature is about that. It sort of frames modeling as robustness analysis, and it sort of study that. For instance, why? For instance, because when Krugman came out with his core periphery model, there was a whole literature on whether his results depends on assumption it just made for tractability reasons or not, right? So a whole literature that sort of changed a few assumptions and try to check whether these change the results or whether the results are robust under different types of specifications, right? And there is also an emerging literature on the ad hocness of assumption and macroeconomic modeling that also feeds into that, okay? And what that literature asks is, can these assumptions, the one that are made for tractability reasons, be easily relaxed? Do they still hold where alternative tractability assumptions are made? Okay? So there was that deep problem that it may change something crucial has been explicited by you in 2017 in your big handbook paper. You say in some situation, pressure of tractability override important ontological consideration, and the values of formal rigor take over in shaping the focus and strategies of research. This is a worry about contemporary economics that many commentators share, right? So this is a real question, and when we ask that, we're getting towards historical question about what exactly tractability does to the shape of economic knowledge and the type of economic practice economists develop. And later in that paper, you say, I believe the tension between tractability convention and ontological conviction is one of the driving, I may have failed him. The driving is one of the drivers of progress in economics. If the tension were to be systematically resolved by privileging tractability and formal rigor while suppressing ontological convictions, economics would be on the wrong track. Okay? So I wish I knew more about that. Okay? There is this tension. How much does it shape economic knowledge? Right? It's hard for me to. So it's an interesting framework, but there are sort of elements I wish there were more so that I could apply it. One element is lack of other motives, right? Making mentions many other reasons you would make an assumption for. Aesthetic reasons, facilitate calculation is a type of tractability. Publication, I mean, you're going to only publish in the AAR if you make that type of assumptions. So that means conventions. Or gender bias, and there is also one big motive that is missing is ideology. Okay, so the whole literature in methodology is framed in terms of there's three reasons for making assumption, like domain or application, negligibility, and tractability. But even if you don't believe that ideology plays a role, one reason to sort of be conceptually more exhaustive is that it's because everyone outside of this room believes that economics makes assumption for ideology reasons, right? So ideology means a lot of stuff. So to me, ideology rather means you are making an assumption so that you twist your results to fit some policy suggestion about the role of government whatsoever, right? So that's what the public believe. I mean, there are lots of actions. That's what other social scientists believe, some sociologists, some historians. So there is a lot of literature about how economics is biased towards status quo or free market, or how economics is neoliberal. So some view neoliberal in a sort of epistemic fashion, like Phil Mirowski believes that it's a statement about what agent can know or cannot know, but others have a more political view of neoliberalism. So there is a whole literature on that. So that's about the collective ideology of economics. And there are also lots of statements about the individual ideology of economists, okay? And these statements come from other economists. So other economists believe that one reason to make such and such assumption is ideology, okay? Two examples. The first example is Blinder discussing the new classical term, argue that there was no anomaly, that the ascendancy of new classicism in academia was instead a triumph of a priori theorizing over empiricism, of intellectual aesthetics over observation, and in some measure of conservative ideology over liberalism, right? And Krugman, same. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that all of them, the freshwater, have decided on political grounds that they don't want a spending-based fiscal stimulus, right? So that's the first issue, okay? So I'm not a methodologist, and so I'm just wondering what are the reasons not to take this into account. I mean, at least conceptually, okay? I'm going to need it as a historian, because everyone is going to. If I give a paper on tractability, everyone is going to tell me how about ideology, right? That's the first issue. A second one is can we document more what economists themselves believe is the cost of tractability? Okay, I show you in Robinson and Tinbergen, people believe there is a trade-off. Okay, and one way to see the trade-off is, for instance, to look at the last paragraph of their papers and to see what statement do they make on applicability. Do they believe making such assumption for tractability reasons actually endanger the applicability of their papers, right? So this is an example with the optimal taxation literature. And that's really interesting because you realize that economists have all sorts of positions about how problematic it is or is not to make assumption for tractability, right? So if you look at the paper by Mielis that more or less sort of launched that optimal taxation literature. So he concludes that there should not be, the top marginal income tax rate should be 0. Okay? And then he says, this conclusion is based on the analysis of an economy in which a man who chooses to work can work, so I should not wish to see it applied in real economics. Right? So basically he says, I've made a whole lot of assumptions that sort of prevent me from applying that models to the real world so far. Okay? If you look at Atkins and Stiglitz, same type of models, general equilibrium models, that were pretty new. And I mean, this was the first set of models that really transformed public economics in taxation work. They work not on income tax, they work on commodity taxation, and they also have a negative results. And they say, for this and other reasons, because we don't take into account how different types of taxation interact with each other, and because we don't take into account the cost of administration, the theory may be more useful in eliminating the structure of the argument than in providing definite answers to policy issues. Okay? So we gave away something, really. What's interesting is that they actually make a statement. They actually both paper and others make a statement. Okay? Now, the convention is that when you publish the paper in economics, you have a final section on applicability. Otherwise, you can't publish. And a referee can tell you, well, where is your policy recommendation final section, right? But back then, it was not the case, and that's an interesting thing to study. And while it was not the convention, they were making applicability statement after having made some tractability assumptions, okay? Other economists don't make statement at all, okay? And I'm not sure what was the standard, okay? I haven't found that. For instance, two very important papers in the literature are Chamley and Jude on the taxation of capital, both concluding that capital should not be taxed under a very specific set of assumptions. They don't discuss whether capital should actually be taxed, right? They don't discuss it at all. But then comes, for instance, another paper by Atkinson, Cherrier, and Kehoe, who were researching at the University of Minnesota. And so what they do is actually a Chamley-Jude model with heterogeneous agent. Okay, so pretty abstract, but they sort of relax the representative agent hypothesis, and they still conclude that capital should not be taxed. And then they have an applicability statement, and they say, we think that these results should be applied in the real world. And they really say very explicitly, some researcher might disagree with this movement. They might argue that the new theory is just too simple to be applicable to the real world. They're right, and they're wrong. The assumptions are necessary to some extent for the optimal capital income tax to be 0, but the assumptions are not necessarily unrealistic barriers that should block the theory's practical applications. Okay? So you have a whole range of attitudes toward tractability and what it does, okay, if you look around a bit. Right? And the last problem I have with the methodological framework is that it is mostly an individualistic one. Okay? It's about studying a paper or a set of paper. Okay? It's not about studying a whole field or a convention and what the convention does to economics as a whole. And my way of coming to the issue of tractability is through collective effects. Okay? The reason I came to this issue is because I was dissatisfied with all this economics is ideological literature. Okay? Why? Because if you make the statement that economists are ideological, you assume intentionality. Okay? You can see it here in this example. Okay? So that's example that are not about macro, but you can do the same about macro. It's about Piketty research. And this is a paper that is critical of Piketty. It says he's making mistakes. He used opaque methodological choice, and there's cherry picking the source. Okay, so what they say is that they distort their research on purpose. I mean, knowingly, intentionally. Okay, and sort of the debates were so bad that you find claims in other papers like that are critical. I'm going to have a critical statement on Piketty's book, but this article does not question Piketty's integrity. And why would you even say that? Okay, if you didn't have a whole literature actually saying these people are willingly distorting their results. So that's a kind of statement that goes same with antitrust. Okay, these people are twisting these results to please their funding, their funding sources. Okay, so if it means that if you're going to make a claim that such and such economist is ideological or choose these assumption for ideological reason, you're going to have a very good smoking gun. Okay, and it's really hard to find. Okay, so and usually people are over making these claims. Okay, I don't have a smoking gun that Lucas is making any ideological assumption. I don't. I mean, people have been looking up for decades, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life trying to prove that kind of thing. It's not interesting for me. Okay, so what's the alternative? Well, another way to view. So that's big claims about individual ideology. There is another way to consider what's going on, is to say, well, what if economists are making choices, assumption choices, or modeling choices for tractability reasons, but the aggregation of these choices filters reality, okay? And sort of produce blind spot. Like, I'm going to use, as an individual, I can use the representative agent assumption for various reasons. Tractability, negligibility, ideology, whatever, okay? But the thing is, everyone uses it, okay? You see it in seminar, and the next seminar you adopt the assumption, and then the other one adopts the assumption, and then you get published, and then you get tractable models, so you can actually solve your model. And sort of like 10 years later, everyone is using it. And so you can't really see distributional effects anymore, okay? So what is interesting, so I came up with various questions. Some of them I can't answer. Some of them I'm interested in answering, and others I'm not so interested in answering. But it's like, can you separate out ideological from tractability motives in making assumptions, okay? And what's the consequences of tractability assumption becoming conventional, okay? Not just one economist making it, the whole field making these assumptions, okay? They become standard, then become conventions, okay? So you're moving for individual choices of assumption to collective choices of assumption in a profession, okay, for tractability reason. And what's the aggregate effect on those tractability move on the shape of economic knowledge? Does it create blind spots? Or does it shape the knowledge in very specific ways, okay? And from there, I came to the question that I would like to research on, and I can't. That is, to what extent does tractability shape the practice economists develop and the knowledge they produce, okay? So that's not my core research question, but I would like to actually research on that. And I'm going to end up by, there is a whole lot of questions historians can ask on the basis of this basic question. I'm just going to mention two. And that's different types of questions from the question methodologists ask. But that's the same kind of object nonetheless. One type of question I want to ask is, what are different types of tractability, okay? And how they tie to different concepts of acceptable solution, okay? Over time, what's a good solution has changed, okay? When people say pen and pencil solution, at first it was just diagrammatic solution. Then we moved to closed form solution. You get an example here. This paper develops a framework that delivers tractable, that is closed form contract. Okay, so there is a clear association still now in economists' mind between what is tractability, something that brings that means you can solve your model, in which way you solve your model by getting a closed form solution. Okay, but there are alternatives. You can do numerical approximation, and more economists do it, right? And that raises question: is there any competition between alternative tractability strategies? Okay, people tend to say there was not much numerical approximation before because we didn't have the computers or we didn't have the techniques. But people like Ken Jude, for instance, they would tell you the major journals are hostile to serious computational work. So that kind of solutions, and you can get a job at top economic department without publication at journal like Econometric. Okay? I don't want to, I have no way to know whether this is a true statement or not a true statement. What I mean is you have different way of getting a tractable model. You can have, for instance, micro foundation, or you can say, no, I don't want to go there. I can keep doing sort of ISLM, or I am not getting a closed form solution, but I'm getting this assumption, and I'm going to move to try to find a numerical approximation whatsoever. Okay? How does this work? How did economists move from one to another? Whether competition, whether debates, what's the underlying epistemological change behind that? Okay? And the second question, if I go even deeper, so I'm talking about tractability conventions. I'm not even sure there's always been tractability conventions. What if it's new? What if it's just like 40 years? For instance, I can tell you stories about how empirical macro was in the 60s and 70s, and it was a hot mess. It was wild. You were allowed to try to solve your model empirically, whatever it takes, basically. Okay. So if you actually read the archive on, for instance, estimating the FRB model, the model that is used, that was developed by Modigliani and Ando and used at the Fed to predict, it was hundreds of equations. The blocks were done by several economists. They were not fitting together. When you added the wage block, the simulation were totally blowing out. So you could take down for like 2 years the weight equation if you wanted. You could estimate one block with one techniques, like block estimation, another block with some sort of maximum likelihood, yet another block with early Bayesian techniques or whatsoever. You can do whatever you want. Okay? This is a letter by Frank Deleuve, who is responsible for the model at the Fed, who is writing to Modigliani, who is responsible for the project as a whole. And he writes, we change the total consumption equation by reducing the current income weight and increasing the lag income weight, which Modigliani was not really happy about. We get a slight further reduction of simulation if we change the consumption so as to reduce the importance of current income and increase the importance of total consumption. Okay? These two kind of change taken together probably mean that we revise the model, the multiplier will build up more gradually, and the government expenditure multiplier will exceed the tax multiplier. You win. So you can tweak the models in all sorts of ways. And so the archive are really piles of that, of tweaking models, okay? Or trying to get numbers no matter what, okay? And when you move to macroeconomics in the 80s, it's totally different. There are assumptions that are legit and some that are not, okay? You can make some types of assumption, you cannot make others. You can have some types of functional forms, you cannot have others. You can have simulation in a very restricted way, but you don't have any large scale use of simulation. Is it because of technical reasons? Is it because of epistemological reasons? Is it because of authority reasons? I don't know, but that's a real question. Okay? So, to conclude, I've made two claims. I believe historians cannot provide a thorough account of the development of practice in the production of knowledge in economics if they don't pay attention to tractability, how decisions that don't seem important to economists may have shaped the way economists work and model, and their results might be really important. My problem is that decisions made for tractability purpose are usually considered auxiliary, transitory, and non-distortive by economists, so they don't really talk about it. They're not really articulated. Okay, they're just gonna say, for convenience, I made that assumption. Or if you go to economic seminar, okay, so I choose that form for my social welfare function because such and such seminal paper does so. And that's it, right? And that means that my usual tool as a historian, like doing archival work, doing interview, I even try to do some text mining, but I mean, what do you retrieve, right? People will hardly say tractability this or tractability that. So I can't use them, okay? So I have that object, that I believe matter, that I know you think matter too, because you've written on that, and I can't actually study it. So can you help me? I'm done.
Questions? Who wants to start? Don?
Thanks. That was very interesting and informative. Lots to think about there. One consideration that I think sometimes also, and when I just reflect on practice, and practice that we need in my group, and what kinds of things are argument stoppers when we're debating with each other about what modeling features to try, right? And so sometimes we'll talk about tractability, not necessarily using that word, right, amongst ourselves. And it's often a given project will be in the context of conceived future project. And you can sort of see there are often decision points where you could throw the kitchen sink analytically at some small problem and maybe get a better, or closer, more accurate empirical specification if you did that. But you'd wreck the possibility that work will lead on to and be integrated with other work you're planning to do and fit in the wider framework you're trying to build up, right? So in other words, when I think of the real day-to-day driving kind of constraints that lead us, we wouldn't think of doing this thing, or we wouldn't think of doing that thing, just for the sake of, getting a slightly more accurate specification of data. That, I think, is a driving thing. And then, of course, perhaps that's what you were alluding to when you say you needed to look not just at whether Krugman is is advocating this sort of tractability or that sort of tractability, but what evolution do you see over the course of his work? But then, of course, it's not just an individual economist's work. All economists every economist is working in some kind of contact with other economists.
So I would say it's dynamic. I mean, I also make some types of assumption like tractability, not just right now, but because I want to get there in 5 years with that type of model, doing that, being used by that sort of actors in public life. Okay. Okay.
I thought maybe I could help with some of the archival work, but with a little bit of a twist. Is take a multidisciplinary stance. And so I knew philosophy of biology.
Okay.
There's a very famous paper by Richard Levin called Strategy of Model Building and Population Biology in 1966. And what's interesting about that is that the issues that he raises, first of all, Levin writes a lot about ideology, but in this paper, he's writing about epistemology. And he's worried about, in 1966, this complex systems that are being studied, population and biology and population ecology. And he wraps the notion of tractability, it's subsumed under different epistemic constraints. It's actually quite a follow-up to Don's question here, because here he subsumes it under the epistemic goals of understanding, predicting, and manipulating nature. And tractability is part of another set of factors where you do some trade-offs. So he spends a lot of time on trade-offs. He spends a lot of time on another kind of concept that may be useful to you, robustness of theories, that sort of thing. So anyway, that might be a good thing. In philosophy of biology, at least my corner, this is a hugely influential paper and it's used quite a bit. And I wonder if that's helpful to the economists, given that there's a sort of historical parallel between the study of
that's really cool.
in population genetics.
Yeah. Comparative work is really a big, very difficult and something I always have on my mind. I mean, the next question: how do the others do? Other science, do they have the same trade-off? Do they have this? Do they have more reflexivity, or is it a single shot? Or you say it was influential, so probably it was more than just like one paper on the topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your interesting thought. You can use a concept that I think most methodologists would employ here, that is the concept of inference. So tractability powers a particular type of inference machine, namely one whose output, whose results, that I think Don was suggesting, are determinate. And so culturally, perhaps not methodologically, we are predisposed supposed to produce specific, perhaps univocal outputs. The axiomatic rational choice theory is example par excellence. Power of the analysis is that it tells us specific things that are relatively uncontroversial. So if you want to talk about kinds of tractability, you might ask yourself about different types of inference machines or different types of outputs. So suppose if axiomatic choice theory relies on at least manifestly not inconsistent assumptions about the nature of preferences, suppose that you, in another narrative social science tradition, formulated inferences in terms of problematizing a subject matter, that is, adopting manifestly inconsistent assumptions as a dialectical tradition as I would, I'm sure, recognize. And what you produce then is not a determinate univocal output, but a set of questions. And if science is an ongoing process, questions sometimes defeat half-dependence, which I think was Founder's argument. So I suggest that you think about cultural norms regarding, scientific cultural norms regarding what type of inference machine we're really after.
Do you have reference to start with?
Anything in the dialectical tradition, which would be one example of a
Okay.
Which is Ivan and who, besides Hegel?
No,
Now to begin with the Hegel.
no,
How many times do you have
it's not
to-
economics. It's not really, it's more like humanities.
Yeah, I'd better start with something that can speak to me directly. That rather than rereading the whole of Hegel to try to.
I don't know this humanities. I mean, Marx thought he was doing science.
Yeah.
It's a different type of output
Okay.
in an inference, and the inference machine depends upon how you define tractability. Your question, what kind of
Yeah,
tractability?
I see.
And tractability is a matter of the relationship between assumptions.
Okay.
Yes, maybe this is related to a previous question. So, why there are, as I think of the problem, tractability can be framed as one of the epistemic virtue of a model. It may have simplicity, parsimony, robustness. So why did you choose to focus on tractability? And then from an historical viewpoint, maybe if you look for how economists use the word tractability, you find some kind of history. If you look at simplicity, you may find another history. So I think that when you say that economists do not discuss explicitly tractability, maybe they discuss that kind of issues under the name of simplicity, robustness, or parsimony. So I think that focusing on tractability as a single word from an historical viewpoint may be somehow problematic, or maybe not, but I think this is an issue.
That this is niche, you mean? Okay. Yeah, I see no reasons why. Well, you could have 7 research program on the 7 epistemic virtues that I mentioned at the beginning. That's one thing. So far, for the moment, I mean, for the very reason you actually simplify when you model, I don't see any reason to start by taking them all together. And so my case also rests on the fact that it's one economists don't think much about, and yet it's the bread and butter of what they do on a daily basis. Okay, so there is this loose rule of thumb of what I see in seminars, basically. So of course the proof is in the making. I agree with you. So.
Thanks, Beatrice. So I agree with your first point that I need to have a handle on tractability to know what is happening and why. But unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be a clear answer to what tractability is. Maybe I can just illustrate that with 2 examples. So when I was asked, so Kemper, when he was Paul Kemper was getting auction theory, when he was describing the way he went about building models, he kind of said, you haven't filled a number of rubbish bins with discarded models, then you're not doing a good job. But he wasn't discarding the models because the initial assumptions were wrong. He was discarding them because they actually didn't work out. They weren't tractable. And then the assumptions were adjusted accordingly. Then you've got Martin Browning on the kind of structural econometric side, who talks about sort of modeling as carpentry. And if you think about just those two economists describing their discarding models, you discard models that have counterintuitive implications. Right? Now, what you decide is a counterintuitive implication could very well be a function of your ideological position or stance. But you could have to justify that on grounds of tractability. So, I mean, it would be great if you could find some kind of, if you could construct some kind of clear definition of how to be using or clear set of standards, but I think it's highly unlikely.
Yeah, well, that's a question of method. So I don't have a systematic way to get at it. I just want to raise awareness to the fact that, I mean, economists are not even trying to be, I mean, there should be more study about the daily practice of economists, and it's not about having big thought about modeling and how many assumptions you make, and you twisting all the time. Again, what I see in seminar is people writing models because other people wrote that way, and they, at some point, reason why such and such assumption is made is sort of forgotten at some point. While what I was saying is that when you go back to the first paper in that stream, it was clear that this was not supposed to be permanent, right? So I think it's important. I don't know to what extent. I might not come with a design right now, but the idea was that, like, for instance, what you suggest about biology or on the inference machine, if I clarify the object I'm trying to catch enough, at some point when I see a proxy, I recognize it. Just like, well, to talk about research, I and many other people did, I mean, there's a research line about how the structure of economics is changing, right? And how economists think that the structure of their discipline as a whole is changing, right? There are many ways you can research that. You can do big text mining or bibliometrics to see how co-citation forms cluster that change over time. That's one way to do it. And for me, it's just about finding the right proxy, okay? If I want, people don't discuss the structure of their discipline, or not that much, or change the way they do so over the 20th century, for instance. My proxy was the GL code, because this is a very well-rounded object, but this is one case in which there were very explicit discussion about the structure of the discipline as a whole every 10 years. And it's by just researching the GL code, I was able to sort of like understand what discourse, how views about what the structure, whether there is theory on top or whether you can separate theory and applied work, and when macro emerge and how micro and macro separate and whatsoever. Well, so that's a kind of research I do, like finding the right proxy. So yeah, I'm not expecting people to tell me, okay, here's the good stuff to research that's going to allow you to try to catch that, okay? But I want to be prepared. So.
What's interesting is I just think it varies a lot across economists. So I'm not just saying you're not going to find a specific standard. I'm just saying I don't think there is one.
Okay.
This is fascinating. You raised a lot of questions. One dimension I'd like to have your look at is the implications of tractability for hypothesis testing. For example, let's just take behavioral, where we have a long tradition of point null hypotheses and diffuse non-point alternative hypotheses. It's EUT or it's not EUT, but I don't know exactly what it is. One of the developments has been the development of point alternative hypotheses and the implications of that. Now, I only ever do empirical work in the context of theory. So this is where, if you go back and read the archives of Savage, which are online and are magnificent. Savage, he didn't use the T word, but he talked extensively prior to theory of statistics about why he had some alternatives to his axioms that generate the results of his primary theorem, where he was actually looking at what we now in modern terms would call uncertainty and ambiguity. He explicitly decided not to put that in because his objective, and again the word tractable means to control or influence somebody, he was trying to convince people of the concept of subjective probability. There was a clear broader debate going on there, frequentists versus Bayesians and so forth. Now, go to Ellsberg's work later, and again his archives are available, in particular when his PhD thesis was published. He wrote a long essay with it. He, in fact, had some point alternative hypotheses to Savage. But what he chose for tractability reasons, I would say, not to present those because he was afraid people would say, oh, that's exactly what you mean by ambiguity. I can reject that. And he was trying to say, no, it's ambiguities, that's one. He has this beautiful expression, and I'll finish this, and it's appropriate for someone at the Pentagon Papers. He said, there's one way to tell the truth, there's an infinite number of ways to tell a lie. So he was afraid that if he posited a specific point alternative hypothesis about ambiguity, that would mean people would not realize there's a whole raft of ways to model ambiguity. So that's an instance which is a great inflection point in economics, but where you can go back to the archives and the theorists that sort of made different decisions about tractability, my word, your word, for different purposes. And I think that would be a really, I'd love to see somebody do something on that.
I love to see someone else, and for someone from you. Or
No, you, yeah.
okay.
Thank you. Nice talk. I agree with you that tractability is all pervasive. I also agree with you that there's some ideology that's involved with tractability. Nevertheless, I'm a little bit afraid that whether you will ever get anywhere with the research program where you try to demonstrate the ideology by different choices of tractability assumptions. You see, because often people they make these ideology claims when they find some methodological practice so crazy that they can't have any other explanation for why these people are so crazy other than that they are autological. And this makes it very difficult for anybody to make a justified good claim about ideology, because then you have to, your argument for the others being wrong has to be so strong that everybody believes you.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, that's I describe where I came in. I mean, what got me started to think about tractability. But there are definitely, I don't want to go back to where I started. So now I'm set on that question about what tractability does and whether the conventions have changed and whether they have been tractability conventions. That is not even very clear. Also, whether it's strong in every field, like maybe macroeconomics is strong tractability conventions and development economics doesn't. I don't know. That's something to look at. I don't need to go back to the ideological questions, clearly. No one will know, as I say. Even the term, I mean, it means everything and nothing. That's why the hope is that I can substitute all the types of discussion that talking about that notions of ideology that no one agree what it even means, and no one can prove anything about that. So yeah, I don't plan to go back to the ideology thing, clearly.
Thanks a lot. So maybe it's not a useful historical method, but I just wonder if some kind of experimental philosophy approach can be useful. So you cannot really trace the history, but you can get some kind of snapshot of what's the current understanding of the concept of tractability among economists by doing some kind of a
Survey?
quasi-experimental.
Like what?
Well, you can come up with some vignettes and then manipulate elements that you consider important as a tractability, and then you do the big-scale survey among economists, and then you might find interesting patterns across different fields of economics or different generations. So that could be one way of, because you said that the problem is that they don't really talk about it.
Yeah, exactly.
But this kind of conceptual survey is one way of letting economists speak about what they don't talk about.
That would, I mean, it's everything is having the good example to not trick them, but to actually elicit that kind of ideas about tractability, and that takes an economist that knows very well the practice of the field and a good philosopher to just propose the right, like if you want to choose between two statements and that kind of things. Yeah, I'm not. If that's an idea, but I'm not the best one to do that. Clearly, I mean, yeah, but sure, something to think about.
Thank you for really interesting talk. I was wondering if there might be some interesting parallels with not tractability with other kinds of conventional scientists use in other fields. So like shared assumptions and agreements about methodological standards are often a necessary condition for developing scientific communities and courses. It's somewhat similar to what Ross was saying. In those communities, often the relevant question is not so much justified or not, but what the aggregate effects are, which is actually the point you talked to. And I wonder, this was also partly put out this way, I take it, and I wonder if there's some parallel to work elsewhere. So in psychology, there's been a lot of meta-analyses of long-term psychological studies where people have tallied up the different effect sizes different psychology results have had on certain claims, causal effects. They've said that if you tally up all the different experiments, you have it's almost statistically impossible for the experiments that have been reported to be the only things that have ever been studied. There's essentially something missing there. So I say, what I'm saying is, I wonder if there's any way of tallying up different kinds of predictions or things in economics to look at the aggregate effect of these kind of individual probability assumptions in the same way that's going on in psychology, in the same way that kind of reveals, I suppose, aggregate biases even when the individual studies might be acceptable in some sense. So in psychology, that's because of missing negative results, but in economics, it might be kind of other things you might reveal through that kind of aggregate studies. I don't know exactly what you might do, but it might be similar.
So what are you going to compare tractable to intractable results?
No, you might compare, say, a set of, so say lots of different, I know it's generally equilibrium models in modelling of the climate economics, right? You use a lot of these models are quite similar, take similar tractability assumptions, and might want to then pinpoint the different results they have and think about how that's, and statistically whether that makes sense, whether that fits, what you think of normal distribution, etc., and see what kind of, maybe there's something missing, maybe another kind of way of modelling, I don't know, something like that. I'm not just suggesting that, I'm saying there's a nice parallel with psychology in that there is this kind of testing of the aggregate results of standard conventions. I mean, you probably know how to do that.
Actually, in that case, there's a good example, if I may just pick up on this point, just in terms of the risks of tractability. I'm talking about CG modelling, trade policy, and climate change modelling, which I work in. Everyone's merged around the same data set we have because of tractability. It's there, it's easier, it's got all the countries, it's got all the things. A lot of the results are very, very similar because of the same data set. Now, 3 cheers of people put the data set together, it's a great data set, but that's a case where tractability may well have put people under the light looking for their keys rather than elsewhere. So I do think that there are examples.
But that's conditional. I mean, comparability is conditional on the strength of conventions and hierarchy in economics versus, say, biology or psychology or whatsoever.
But that's tractability of data is a different.
Yeah, that could work with tractability of data, sure.
So I was wondering, one of the things you showed to us is that the tractability isn't an obvious activist concept. That it's the fact that it comes up and goes away, that we analytically can see it playing roles. Whether you should, what that's telling you that you need to treat it as an analyst concept, and as a result, that kind of forecloses the idea that you can somehow harvest it. You maybe can draw through the kind of text analysis some kind of semantic fields where there's something like tractability or synonyms of it moving around, but I wonder if that's really the most interesting aspect.
No, but that doesn't work anyway. So.
What the research is telling you is that this is far more of a practice element than a conceptual discussion that is being had. So it's far more on the doing than the elaborating, etc. And if that's not suggesting that the right methodology to employ, well, it gives you several choices, but one is ethnographic, going to a lab and listening to the way people handle the problem of tractability, which is kind of more sociological, less historical. And the other one would be kind of more of an ancestry of concepts, in the way that, not concepts, an ancestry of models, and how those pose themselves, which seems to be closer to what you want to do.
That's an idea I've been toying with. But doing so sort of requires that I give up on trying to get a historical narrative, a dynamic narrative. So all I'm gonna get or capture by doing that is, for instance, how like macroeconomists or LSE are discussing tractability when they sort of like work together whatsoever, and I won't get any comparison with what they did like 20 years ago, or what they do at MIT, or what they do at the Fed, or whatever.
But you started a discussion that other people could go and look 20 years ago,
Not through ethnographic methods, right?
Archival.
Yeah.
Interviews or histories. At least we have get it started. But then I think there's also the alternative is to look at families of models and families of model practice. I think it's closer to
Yeah.
I think find interesting and place these in the sort of a narrative of evolution for change.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, thanks, great. It was beautiful. You requested help, so I'll
Okay.
make a couple of comments in this period. Regarding the question whether tractability always was there, or whether it's a new thing in economics, I wonder if we stretch its notion a little bit, to generalize it is a wish. You can see that it's always been there, and it's always will be there, and it's everywhere. Whenever we use a language or framework or style of reasoning or whatever, it's always a matter of tractability. We step out of these frameworks and things become intractable. So it's tractability is a function of the framework, something like that. And this framework changes, and then you can trace the history of these different kinds of frameworks and different kinds of tractability, etc. So maybe you can write history of tractability itself, plus its routes.
Okay.
About ideology, you said we haven't, methodologists haven't paid attention and how to do ideology. And this is, I would say yes, you're partly right. We have kind of neglected it, and we might ask why. And here, just to speculate a bit, maybe it's because of reputational reasons, both for the sake of the field itself, because methodology uses that name, and this would kind of keep it that way. We want to be more neutral, as it were, in order to work the reputation of methodology, and also individually, if we were to dig into these ideological commitments behind these various kinds of assumptions, we would have a very hard time not disclosing all
Yeah,
the
sure.
individual ideological commitments, and some of us wouldn't like that.
Yeah, two things. I naively thought you would be protected because it would be enough to entertain it as a conceptual possibility. I mean, you actually don't need to say whether there is an ideological motive or not. And it was not, I mean, I didn't really mean to say you not handling ideology. It's sort of more a matter of bridging different strands. From the outside, it seems more a matter of bridging different strands of methodology, because there is a huge literature on values and ethics, and there is also a huge literature on policy applications of models. And so in these two, that is distinct from the literature on why make that assumption when you model. So it exists in methodology discussion about ideologies, and they're really good ones. It's just a matter that it's different. It's three different types of literature that don't pull their source in common, basically. That's more about that.